Hello, my name is Everix Mahan, and this presentation will explore the young adult horror/thriller novel Compound Fracture by Andrew Joseph White. We'll be looking at the novel through the lens of queer rhetoric, and we'll bring in some concepts from early in our Materialist rhetoric unit as well. I think Andrew Joseph White's novels are perfect for the concepts we've talked about in class, as all of White's narrators are transmasculine and most are autistic as well. Queer monstrosity also takes center stage in his stories, so he is a great example to discuss here. First of all, spoiler warning, I guess, for if you're ever planning to read this YA novel, but also this presentation will discuss, to varying degrees, transphobia, police brutality, ableism, and gore. Like I said, it is at its core a horror/thriller novel, so we can expect a bit of discomfort in general. Before we begin our analysis of Compound Fracture, we should understand the author and what the novel itself is about. So Andrew Joseph White is an autistic trans man who grew up in the Shenandoah Valley, which encompasses parts of western Virginia and eastern West Virginia. That section of land is in Appalachia between the Blue Ridge Mountains and the Ridge and Valley Appalachians. He has a BA and an MFA in creative writing from George Mason University, which is basically in DC, and now lives in Virginia, so he's very central to the Appalachian area in general, which is not super relevant to his other books, but does play a large part in Compound Fracture. White has been very successful with all four of his books, but he's perhaps most popular for his 2022 YA horror novel, Hell Followed With Us, which is soon to be adapted as an animated film produced by Lily Wachowski, one of the creators of the Matrix series, which is super cool. Trans and autistic monstrosity play massive roles in all of his books, which is one of the reasons why he is one of my favorite authors of all time. And another reason I like him is he's very upfront about content warnings. In-depth ones are on his website, and more abbreviated ones are in the author's notes at the front of his books. Also, he is quick to assure people that the cute dog on the cover of Compound Fracture is not harmed at all. Also, here's a screenshot of his FAQ page, so that's a little glimpse into how he feels about his writing. Anyway, don't get me started on the rest of his books. I'll never stop talking, and I've probably made this video longer than necessary anyways. Speaking of which, buckle up for a full synopsis because I think it's kind of necessary. Released in 2024, Compound Fracture was White's third YA novel set in the fictional West Virginian county of Twist Creek. The whole book is written in the West Virginian Appalachian dialect as well. It centers around a 16-year-old born and raised Appalachian trans guy and self-proclaimed socialist named Miles Abernathy. Miles is autistic but doesn't know it quite yet, and that's canon. His friend Cooper is one of the only people who's actually cool with him being trans. His parents aren't transphobic per se, but they're definitely hesitant about Miles's coming out. The Abernathys have a long-standing blood feud with the Davieses, the sheriff's family, dating back to the West Virginia Coal Wars, during which Miles's ancestor, Saint Abernathy, which is an insanely cool name, by the way, incited a rebellion that ended with the Davies hammering a railroad spike into his mouth and killing him. Saint is well known for being a proud socialist and a mean son of a bitch. A few years before the events of the book, Sheriff Davies found out about a grassroots attempt to unseat him and caused an accident, which killed Cooper's mom, left his dad addicted to painkillers, and permanently disabled Miles's dad, who managed to recover from his following opioid addiction. And here's where the book starts. After Miles finds evidence of Sheriff Davies' role in this accident, the sheriff's son Noah and his two friends Eddie and Paul beat Miles nearly to death, leaving his face permanently disfigured, and Miles soon finds out that the sheriff was fully aware of it but refuses to do anything. Shortly after, Miles begins seeing the ghost of Saint Abernathy from time to time, which understandably freaks him out a bit. Miles ends up hitting Eddie with the door, who falls and hits his head on a rock, which kills him. He calls Cooper to help him hide the body in the abandoned local mines, and Cooper suggests that they kill Paul and Noah too, saying that they'd be doing the county a favor. Saint leads Miles out to the spot that he was killed, and upon being shown a railroad spike on the ground, Miles decides Saint is trying to get him to get revenge, and he agrees with Cooper's plan. Saint also reveals that he is a trans man. So, diversity win, your dead socialist's ancestor was trans. Yippee. Miles finds that his old friend Dallas Foster and their family are running a restaurant nearby, and it's also a worker co-op. Dallas has also been permanently disfigured in the accident the sheriff caused, and their autistic sister-in-law Amber plays a large role in Miles slowly realizing throughout the book that he himself is autistic. Cooper, who used to be friends with Dallas as well, is super hesitant to connect with them again and isn't in favor of Miles reconnecting, despite Dallas really getting it about transness and the permanent changes to their appearance. Cooper and Miles set out to kill Paul, but he convinces Miles to let him just get out of town because he's also a victim of the Davies family to a degree. Cooper doesn't let him get away and shoots him instead, which really upsets Miles, and he goes to Dallas's house, where he and their family plan an event where they'll release the evidence condemning Sheriff Davies. Cooper is not in favor and plans to kill Noah himself. At the County 4th of July festival, the Davieses out Miles as trans. Later that day, at the event the Fosters were planning, Miles openly admits that his disfigurement is the Davies' fault, leading to them storming the restaurant and attempting to burn it down. Miles runs home to find Cooper dead on his porch and receives texts from Noah saying to meet him in the mines, resulting in an altercation that leaves Noah dead. Miles is able to call his dad just before the sheriff finds him and tries to kill him just like Saint. He's stopped by the rest of the Abernathys, including Miles's dog Lady, who basically tears him apart. The rest of the county tries to rebuild itself in the aftermath. Also, Dallas and Miles end up in the beginnings of a queer platonic relationship after Miles realizes he's autistic and aromantic, which he struggles with throughout the book due to his autism and feeling pressured to like Cooper romantically. I promise this was a big part of the plot in general, it's just hard to fit in here. So, in the end, there's still hope and good vibes in general. And also, can we just appreciate this cover art, because it's gorgeous. Anyways. Now that we have a clear general understanding of what compound fracture is, we can explore our queer and materialist rhetorical concepts. Parallels with ideals in queer and materialist theory. So compound fracture generally reflects injustices historically commonly addressed in queer theory and history. Miles's and his family's struggle to hold down jobs due to disability and the general poorness of their working class community illustrates barriers to class mobility and work. Similarly, the people of Twist Creek County in general lack adequate medical support and education. Many of Miles's medical issues, including removing stitches and recovering from the beginnings of an oxycodone addiction, have to be addressed outside of medical facilities because their local hospital is so underfunded and expensive. The only reason Miles receives any kind of quality care is because his mother is a nurse, but we can see that other characters, like Cooper's father, still struggling with his addiction, do not have access to the same support. Through the Davies' actions, we can see clear examples of police brutality and cultural injustices regarding demonization of queer life hidden under false acceptance. When they out Miles, they pretend to be supportive of his identity, but the action is clearly motivated by the hope that Miles's family and community at large will reject and isolate him, leaving him an easier target. We can even see denial of queer experience from Miles's parents initially, though they don't hurt him on purpose. In class, we've also discussed the concepts of broadly queer, meaning anyone ostracized for not conforming to norms, and narrowly queer, meaning anyone ostracized for not conforming to gender, sex, and sexuality performance-specific expectations. Compound Fracture exposes the obvious differences between being broadly and narrowly queer in the characters of Cooper, who could be considered broadly queer due to his general social ostracization from powerful people in town, partially based on his association with Miles, and Dallas and Miles, who are narrowly queer in that they're both transgender and non-heterosexual. Cooper, Miles, and Dallas align on some of their ideals, but Cooper has much more of an every man for themselves mindset. His plans and attempts to unseat power are highly individualistic, whereas Miles and Dallas are much more community-oriented regarding both queerness and class solidarity, possibly indicating a broader truth about how broadly and narrowly queer people often differ in their methods of pursuing social change. Also, like Comrade by Jody Dean, Compound Fracture is set in contrast to survivor and system rhetoric. In this kind of rhetoric, survivor rhetoric is voiced through identity and allyship, but creates the idea that there is no identity beyond the survivor's trauma and pain, leading to an emphasis on survival rather than improving the system that enabled the trauma to occur. Ultimately, this results in the assertion that certain problems are just systemic, so big that we can't fully understand it, much less change anything about it. Compound Fracture appears to take a different stance. Miles does survive trauma, but it's not what defines him as a person. Instead, he's primarily defined by his transness, neurodivergence, cultural experiences as a West Virginian, socialist views, and the connections that he makes with other people. The end of the book indicates that systemic problems are not impossible to fight. Is police brutality the result of a failed system? Yes. However, individual actions can be taken to hold people accountable. I'm not advocating for Miles's methods, but you have to admit they had an impact. Hauntings, monstrosity, and trans rage. As such, monstrosity and trans rage play obvious roles in Compound Fracture's plot. Monstrosity is used as an othering device reclaimed by queer people, especially trans people, to reject normative views of what is natural and human. Dallas and Miles often discuss their frustration at how people look at and talk about them due to their bodies. For example, after Miles is attacked, he remarks, "Gotta admit, it's hard to look like a straight A, keep it together daughter when you're a smear of roadkill held together with gauze and surgical tape. It's hard to look like anything, really." Dallas specifically talks about how their identity is partially rooted in their fatness and their being a burn victim, and how they're often frustrated with how people try to censor themselves and how they talk about them. They say that their brother uses all the soft words, the dance around it stuff. Burn survivor, facial difference, whatever. Disfigured is what they want them to call them. It's a loaded word, sure, but it's true. Additionally, Miles's feelings throughout the novel can definitely be characterized as trans rage, especially considering that his autism gives him a level of awareness of the instability of language describing his identity and personhood. In general, throughout the book, Dallas helps Miles to accept his altered appearance and channel his anger into something productive, both politically and interpersonally, reclaiming both monstrosity and rage as trans and disabled people. Also, haunting and spectrality play central roles in Compound Fracture, as you might be able to guess from the synopsis. In the introduction to her book, Gothic Queer Culture, Laura Westergaard describes queer haunting as ongoing reverberations of historical traumas, which we can see in various forms in Compound Fracture. For example, Miles's trans identity is weaponized against him. He is physically threatened several times, and he's quite often concerned with his identity being taken seriously by other people, which is why he attaches to Cooper, the first person who unquestioningly supports his transness, so strongly. All of these events actively contribute to paranoia and social isolation as lingering effects in Miles's life, indicating queer haunting. Also, Saint Abernathy is a literal ghost haunting Miles's life. His family's past is producing constant, lingering effects on Miles's decision-making and state of mind. Saint indicates the atemporal nature of queer haunting, illustrating how what little progress has been made since he was killed is extremely fragile. And as a result, the past haunts and disrupts the present. Queering history, queer invention, and identity politics. When Miles looks through old photographs of his family, he finds a picture of Saint and an unnamed coal miner holding their daughter, leading to Miles thinking, "Can I commit the cardinal sin of historians and ask if y'all were gay?" Eventually, Saint directly reveals himself to be trans as well by exposing his binder. By explicitly establishing Saint's transness, Andrew Joseph White exhibits a queering of the world, which indicates an intentional reinterpretation of history. Quite often, famous queer people who seem obviously trans to trans people, like James Barrie and Alan Hart, pictured here, are dead-named and their transness is erased in favor of the narrative of a brave lesbian who conceals their womanhood to gain male privilege. White combats this potential revisionist narrative with one of his own, which also serves as countermemory, a form of queer invention that draws on knowledge that has been erased and dismissed by dominant theorists and historians. We can also see queer invention in the creation of the Foster's restaurant, where they have created a safe space for leftists and queer people in this rural area where they otherwise might be unsupported. This space also appeals to identity politics to unite people. They are organizing around a shared identity as working-class rural Americans and Appalachians, which serves as an entry point to their more communist-leaning politics, which centers the exploitation of the proletariat at the hands of the wealthy and powerful, represented by the Davises. Identification and so what rhetoric. We also see several examples of so what rhetoric regarding transness and biological essentialism. For example, when Dallas talks about doubting using they them as a fairly masculine presenting non-binary person assigned male at birth, because people are automatically going to assume that they're a man, Miles promptly responds with, "Fuck that, you're gonna listen to people on Twitter?" In response to people saying binary-looking non-binary people aren't valid, they're basically just saying, whatever, we don't have to listen to you, which I think counts as so what rhetoric. Also, near the end of the novel, Miles being outed is really upsetting to him, obviously, but his grandparents, who were the family members who didn't know about his transness, have that mentality where they kind of go, so what if he's trans? He's still family, and that matters more than anything. Other identities are also formed and focused upon in Compound Fracture, including Miles's aromantic identity. This is very much a side plot, but I think it's very much worth noting because it is such a strong connection point between Dallas and Miles as characters. Dallas helps Miles establish this identity through identification. They give Miles the name to put to the experience, which Miles finds he identifies with, and he uses it going forward to shape his relationships with other people, ultimately connecting more deeply with Dallas and realizing the internalized pressure for alloromanticism he was experiencing with Cooper, constantly feeling like he should be attracted to Cooper because that seems to be what their relationship looks like. That same process of identification happens when Miles realizes he's autistic. One could probably argue that identification doesn't fit with claiming neurodivergence because it's a clear, distinguished neurological/biological difference, but depending on how hard you're leaning into biologics, so is queerness, so I'm counting it. Amber, Dallas's sister-in-law, gives Miles the name and permission to claim it by indicating she understands and actually tried to get his parents to get him tested, though this never happened due to stigma and their area being underserved in that department. In a long, grueling process, Miles comes to accept himself as autistic and identifies with that label, asserting that the result of identification is self-acceptance and greater understanding of the self. And neuroqueer rhetoric, subjectification, and resignification. In that same vein, we can see elements of neuroqueer rhetoric in how Miles is portrayed. For one, Miles frequently talks about how his attempts to mimic allistics is viewed as highly scripted and uncanny hacking, described by Yergo as passing or scripting. Additionally, outside of his family and the Fosters, Miles isn't really taken seriously, especially considering that certain things, like Eddie's death, happened to him purely by accident. A big example would be when Cooper shoots Paul instead of letting Miles allow him to get away. In that moment, Cooper completely disregards Miles' ability to make decisions and robs him of intentionality, marking his hesitation and empathy as weakness, despite Miles having a different, perhaps more humane understanding of Paul's situation as both victim and perpetrator in this cycle of abuse. In disregarding Miles' immediately isolates Miles, rendering him demi-rhetorical, always almost rhetorical, completely different from fully rhetorical beings, also known as allistics. Miles's autistic understanding of the world, which refuses to lose its empathy and drive to understand how others function, is dismissed. Miles, as an autistic person, is constantly and deliberately in a process of subjectification, shaping his selfhood based on his social environment and setting. He is constantly trying to fit in effectively at a complete detriment to his own mental health. However, by the end of the book, he has begun his process of resignification, the process of disrupting expressive norms to create a new meaning, this time of self-image. He has accepted elements of himself he was suppressing and found his place in his community and family, allowing him to continue to expand how he thinks about himself. He is still young and has a long time to grow, but he is beginning this process rather than continuing to try to define himself by others' ideas of normal. And finally, as I think most people know, autism is genetic, and though Saint isn't explicitly autistic, I think there is something to be said about his death literally robbing him of speech. The sheriff's ancestor ended Saint's life by rendering him unable to verbally communicate, and by extension, he attempted to make him completely devoid of the ability to produce rhetoric. Saint experiences the literal version of what Yergo describes as the autistic living death. As a spirit with the railroad spike still lodged in his throat, he is only able to communicate non-verbally, making him demi-rhetorical, unable to become fully rhetorical, and forever marked as different from fully rhetorical beings. Even Miles is not able to understand Saint's intentions fully. For example, he only realizes near the end that Saint showed him the railroad spike not to get him to get revenge, but to get him to find community to rally around him. But once he's accepted that Saint is not a hallucination, he knows better than to assume Saint lacks intentionality completely. By killing him via railroad spike, the old sheriff replaced Saint's reportedly sharp tongue with an inability to produce rhetoric the same way, leaving him literally choking on his own imposed demi-rhetorical state. Overall, I think that Compound Fracture is an impressively complex novel in terms of neuroqueer and materialist rhetoric, especially considering it's meant for young adult audiences. It provides us a clear view into the mind of someone deemed monstrous in many intersecting ways and the isolation caused by this experience, but also gives a somewhat hopeful story exploring the power of community uniting across identity differences to unseat corrupt power. This book explores the complex intersections of class differences, queerness, neurodivergence, and more, showing how inextricable these problems really are. From Saint and Miles especially, we can see that even when voices are silenced in the most final way possible, history has an echo, and those voices will always haunt the dominant narrative.